The flood did not arrive without warning, and the people did not meet it without readiness. Anticipation was a season of its own, marked not on the stone calendars, but in the rhythm of hands, and the bending of backs towards work that looked forward rather than inward. From the moment the last of the spring planting was done, the village began to look forward from the high water months, not with dread, but with a kind of quiet focus, like preparing for a long awaited guest. It began with the channels. These were the veins and capillaries of the land, leading the river's lifeblood to places it could be most useful. Men and older boys waded in the dry beds with simple tools, broad-bladed hoes, baskets for scooping out debris, clearing away the silt that last year's flood had left behind. Their feet found the compacted mud at the bottom by feel alone, pressing and lifting, loosening clumps where the root had begun to grow. Each swing of a hoe made a dumb, thudding sound. Each lifted basket spilled dry earth and old weeds into the banks, where it would later be taken away or reused. The women's work in these weeks was no less vital. They moved along the smaller side channels, repairing the low walls of packed clay that guided the water into household gardens. A crack in the wall, left alone, could widen under the first push of the flood and send precious water spilling into places it was not meant to go. So they smoothed the clay with their palms, dipping into nearby jars to wet it just enough for shaping. Sometimes children followed them, carrying the extra clay in small baskets, their bare feet leaving prints that would be washed away in a month's time. Above all, there was the work of securing what could not be replaced. Storage jars were checked for cracks. Their lids were tested for a tight fit. Tools were cleaned and oiled, then hung from high rafters where the water could not reach them. Even household objects, woven baskets, mats, stools, were given a place above the level where the elders judged the flood would rise. They measured this not with rope or rule, but with memory. Here, one would say, pointing to faint line on the wall, this is where the water touched the year your father was born. Livestock had to be thought of too, though they seemed unaware of the months ahead. Goats were tethered near the high paddock, so they would become used to the ground where they would later spend the flood months. Cattle were led there and back on quiet afternoons, learning the path so that when the time came, they would follow it without fuss. Even the poultry pens were checked before leaks and shaded against the summer sun, so they could be moved home when the waters rose. Preparation was not a single burst of labor, but a gentle layering of readiness over many days. A door hinge was mended here, a clay jar patched there. A boat's side was rubbed with oil to keep it supple, and a paddle was reshaped so it would bite the water cleanly. The river might be weeks away from its swelling, but every action carried the quiet knowledge that it was coming. And all the while, the air itself seemed to grow heavier with the thought of water. Even on days when the sun blazed over dry banks, there was a softness to the wind, a faint trace of damp that came from far upstream. The people knew it was surely, as they knew the feel of the earth under their feet. The flood was gathering somewhere beyond sight, filling its arms for the long embrace of the valley. Evenings in this season had their own mood. The village would gather on the higher grounds, looking out over the river as the last light of day set it aglow. There was talk, yes, about the year's planting, about the repairs still to be made, but there was also long companionable silence. Elders told children the stories of flood past, the years when the water came early, the years when it lingered late, the years when it carried treasures from far away, strange wood, bright feathers, even, once, a carved figure from some upstream shrine, worn smooth by its long journey. And after the stories, the children would sleep more easily, as if they too understand that the river's rising was not a thing to fear, but a thing to meet with open hands and ready ground. In their dreams, perhaps, they saw the wide silver sheet of floodwater stretching to the horizon, boats moving where they had once walked, the land resting under its calm, rich cover. When they woke up, they would see their parents at work again, smoothing clay, mending rope, watching the river, and they would know even without words that everything was in its place for when the flood arrived. The first sight of the rising water was never loud, never sudden. It began as a change in the way the land looked in the early light, a difference you could not quite name until you stood still and let your eyes travel over the familiar lines of the bank. Where there had been dry earth the day before, there was now a darker, dampened strip, as if the oil itself had sighed in relief and drawn the moisture close. The sun was not yet high enough to dazzle through the surface, so the water lay soft under the sky, catching the pale tones of dawn and holding them in ripples that moved without hurry. There was a faint smell too, rich and earthen, but threaded with something sweet, like the scent of cut grass mixed with river weed. If you knelt at the edge and touched the surface, it felt cooler than the air around it, as though it had brought a long memory of rain from far off places. And when you drew your hand back, the skin shone with a thin glaze of silt, so fine it clung like dust yet washed away at the first pass of your fingers. The river had arrived, but it had not yet shown its full intention. This was only the first breath of what was coming. By the second day, the change was undeniable. The water had taken more of the bank, curling into low places where the plants bent under its touch. You could hear it more clearly now. Not a roar, but a patient insistence, the way a potter's wheel turns beneath steady hands. Boats that had rested at a tilt on dry ground now rocked gently at their moorings, the ropes creaking softly as they adjusted to the new depth. Even the light had shifted. It no longer fell cleanly on the earth, but reflected upward from the water skin, casting soft, moving patterns on the undersides of leaves and on the plastered walls of the houses near the bank. Children came to see it, some with their hands tucked behind their backs as if resisting the urge to reach out. Others already crouched at the edge, letting the tips of their sandals slip into the water. Their voices were quieter than usual, not hushed exactly, but softened, as though they too felt the weight of the moment. This was the same river they had always known, but with its rising came the sense that it had stepped a little closer to their lives, crossing an invisible line between what was theirs and what belonged only to the currents. By the week's end, the water has reached the first of the low fields, folding itself over the stubble left from the last harvest. The sound of the land changed with it. Where before the air had carried the dry hiss of wind moving over grain stalks, now it held a gentle lap of water meeting plant stems, a quiet rhythm that seemed to erase the idea of hurry. Men stood at the edges, poles in hand, testing the depth where they would soon be guiding small boats between the flooded plots. Some waded in to check the firmness of the soil beneath, knowing that too much softness could swallow a foot and twist an ankle. They spoke in short exchanges, pointing towards where the water might spread next, where a channel might need to be blocked, where it should be welcomed deeper into the land. The youngest among them carried reeds to mark the new boundaries, pushing them into the soft ground so that tomorrow they could see just how far the flood had come overnight. Each stake was like a conversation with the river, a way of saying, "We see you, we know where you are, and we are ready to meet you here." When the flood had settled into its full breadth, the village no longer moved the way it once had. The paths between houses, once narrow lanes of packed earth and dust, had dissolved into quiet waterways, their edges softened by the gentle touch of water that lapped at walls and courtyards. The scent of the air was thicker now, Not unpleasant, but persuasive. The warm mineral note of wet clay mingling with the sweet green smell of reeds, and underneath it all, the faint trace of fish carried in the current. You could see it in the way people walked too, or rather, in the way they no longer walked as much as they glided. Boats became the measure of distance, their movements slow and deliberate, each stroke of the paddle sending ripples outward like the rings of a bell. Conversation happened midstream. A boat droned alongside a doorway where someone leaned out to speak, their voices carrying across the water in rounded tones. The usual sounds of the village, the shuffle of sandals, the dry rasp of brooms across town, were replaced by the muffled splash of oars and the occasional hollow thunk of wood against wood as two vessels met gently. Even the animals adapted. Goats tethered to the higher terraces learned to watch their footings as they were led along narrow strips of dry ground. Dogs found their voices more often now, gliding freely between houses and little groups, their wakes trailing behind them in neat arrowed lines. Everywhere you looked, the light moved differently, thrown upward from the water's restless skin, so that the undersides of roofs and overhanging palms danced with shifting, liquid patterns. It was as if the village had been set afloat in a great slow mirror, and every step, every gesture, every sound was reflected back softened, slowed, and made part of the river's rhythm. The days in a flooded village unfolded with a rhythm that was not the same as in the dry months. Yet it did not feel unfamiliar. Life was still made up for the same needs and habits. Food to be prepared, work to be done, neighbors to greet. But the pace was dictated by the water's patience. A person might rise with a light, but instead of stepping into the crisp, packed earth of a courtyard, they would stand at the edge of a still pool where their own reflection looked back at them in softened shades. The morning air carried the cool breath of the flood, and it clung to the skin even as the sun began to rise higher. Tasks began in boats, the simple craft carved and patched over many seasons. Their surfaces weren't smoothed by years of palms pushing against their sides to steady them. A man heading to the market might paddle alone, his figure small against the wide gleam of water, the weight of his goods resting neatly in the bow. Women would sometimes travel together, each boat holding a basket of herbs, a string of fish, or a jar of milk, calling out greetings as they passed, the words stretching into a quiet morning air and returning as soft echoes. Children, too young to work but old enough to join the current, learned to keep their balances in the unsteady boats, crouching low and gripping the edges, while older hands pushed them gently towards their errands. The air smelled of wood and warmed by the sun, of the faint stench of wet rope, and of the silt that lay suspended just beneath the surface, waiting to settle back into the fields when the river pulled away again. As the day grew, so too did the life on the water. By midday, the village central spaces, once a square of hard-packed earth between the largest homes, had transformed into a meeting place for boats. Small skiffs bumped gently against one another as people exchanged not just goods but news,